Welcome to Vertical City. I'm your host, Lennon Richardson. During each episode, I interview one of the world's top experts in architecture, urban design, engineering, or ecology so that we can better understand and develop solutions for sustainable living. Thank you for listening, and get ready to join us on another groundbreaking and uplifting episode. Rick Potestio is a Portland, Oregon-based architect and former professor. He has a Bachelor's of Architecture from the University of Oregon and a Master's of Architecture from Syracuse University. He is the founding principal of Potestio Studio and advocates for the development of more dense, mixed-use communities in the Portland area. Portland is growing rapidly, yet it ranks near the bottom of major West Coast cities in terms of density per square mile. In this interview, we discuss Portland's housing crisis, the city's current plan for addressing this issue, and Rick's alternative plan, which calls for the development of self-contained neighborhoods centered around commons, such as parks or schools. We also discuss the prospect of establishing city-wide design principles in order to foster a unity of design, and the concept of zoning, including how this concept might be changed or even abolished to allow for the development of better urban environments. Links and show notes to everything we discuss can be found by visiting verticalcity.org/podcast. All right, well, Rick, welcome to the Vertical City podcast.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on here.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. You've published some really interesting articles recently, so I think this is going to be a quite interesting conversation, not only for the two of us, but for our listeners as well. I want to start just by asking you, I know that Portland is undergoing rapid growth at the moment and that it's facing quite a bit of a housing crisis. And this is being addressed, at least they have a plan. What is the current plan for addressing this housing issue?
Well, I think the current plan for addressing the housing crisis, and I'm not, a politician or a bureaucrat, and so I can't say that I know for certain all aspects of that, but there's different facets. One is the facet that concerns homelessness. The city is looking at various ways to provide safe places for the homeless to camp, to increase, services to the homeless, possibly find funds to build, more permanent shelters. Another part of that housing crisis is the dislocation gentrification issue. And I think the city is looking at ways to bolster, especially for the African American community, certain public investments that could help them retain their businesses or their homes in the area that they've historically lived. And then I think in terms of the general housing crisis, which is essentially one of shortage, the city has certainly been pursuing zoning that enables or allows more apartment building construction on major streets throughout the city. And they're looking at ways to increase the ability to add second units or second homes or structures to individual lots occupied currently by single-family houses. So in Portland, those are called ADUs, or an accessory dwelling unit, and typically it's an independent structure. So the city is looking at liberalizing their laws around those particular structures so that people be more incentivized to build them.
Okay, that sounds like that would be a fairly decent solution to me, and it's something that if I was a homeowner, I would personally probably be pretty interested in doing, a way of increasing my income. Do you have a sense of what might be some of the pros and cons of that?
Well, I think in general, the idea that you could add another unit to either your property or to the structure on your property is a good idea. In essence, it doubles the number of units on a lot. So by correlation, it doubles essentially the density, if you will.
Yeah.
I don't think it should be the primary way in which we increase housing opportunity and thereby, population and unit density. I think in a lot of ways it's the least efficient and least sustainable way to do so, and it's a very expensive way to do so, even though that expense is borne by the owner, the homeowner, the person that has primary lot. And so let me just explain why I think that. First, when you build one of these units, and they're allowed to be up to 800 square feet, in most circumstances, they're building an actual individual house. So it's a mini house, about 800 square feet, which is equivalent to a small one-bedroom apartment. But if you compare building 800 square feet as a mini house versus building 800 square feet as an apartment or as a component of a townhouse, or some other more efficient building type, you'll see that the 800 square feet that you're building requires about almost 3 times the surface area, around 2,100, 2,200 square feet, to enclose that 800 square feet versus an apartment in terms of exposed surface area could be as little as like 400 square feet or less. So in other words, when you think about the efficiency in terms that might be familiar to Buckminster Fuller, you try to think, what's the maximum amount of space that I can enclose with the least amount of surface volume, which, as we know, in housing is surface volume relates not only to the expense of materials, but also the expense of energy that it takes either to heat or cool the interior space. You would instantly come to the conclusion that separating out every 800 square foot as an individual unit is the least efficient way to do it.
Yeah.
And so I question the sustainability principles behind that. Further, what is of most value is land. Land for gardens, land for greenery, land for recreation, land just for vegetation, land for light and air. Land is the one resource that we can't replicate, we can't increase. It's a fixed thing. And so the idea that we would now start to fill all of the backyards of the city with these little independent units doesn't exactly make sense to me. I wonder, well, why wouldn't that space be better used for other purposes? Growing a garden, having a barbecue, recreation for the kids, whatever it may be. It seems that land and the green space and the benefits of air and light that provides is super valuable. And the idea that we would now use that for a bunch of mini houses seems counterintuitive to me from a sustainability standpoint.
I know that urban farming is really a huge thing in Portland, and I think you make a really good point there. So you've been working on an alternative plan that you hope the city of Portland will adopt. What are the key elements of your plan?
First and foremost, my plan accepts increased density in any neighborhood and on any block. So I'm saying that we should abolish the R5 single-family residential zone as a zone designation, and that any lot within the city should be a candidate for a multifamily structure. Secondly, I'm saying that when we consider where these would go, whether they would be distributed uniformly across the city or whether they'd be distributed in some pattern, I would say that within the multifamily menu of typologies, that we would look at hierarchy. So in other words, we've talked about an ADU, which is a very small house in someone's backyard, but we could also talk about the vast array of mid-scale housing that was common in the early 20th century, which includes townhomes, duplexes, triplexes. In Boston, you would have seen triple-deckers, courtyard apartment buildings of many different configurations, as well as small, apartment structures, and even up to, say, a little mini 10-story tower, such as the one that I live in. So there's a great variety of housing typologies that are very high density, but can be constructed on very small lots. And so I think that these are the typologies that the city should really be looking at and pursuing when we talk about increasing the density. But then I say that rather than separating them all out into their separate categories or separate zones, as the city tends to do, that they should be allowed to blend evenly throughout the city. But then I take it one step further and I say that within that blend, possibly we would introduce some rules around the hierarchy of these buildings. And so that comes to my plan, which is to say, in the city of Portland, we have the legacy of parks combined with schools occupying 2 to 4 blocks that are evenly distributed and set at the center of each neighborhood. And so my thought would be that those parks offer an incredible open space opportunity that we could think of in the way an English New England town would think of the Commons. So at the center of any New England town, whether it be a little one out in the countryside or all the way up to Boston with Boston Commons, was always organized around a green space at the center. And generally, the institutions of the town would be located around that green space, and then the houses around that. So my thought would be that we could replicate that model with the already existing park school nucleuses that we have located throughout the city, and then that we could, around them, dedicate our highest density or the top tier of our hierarchy of residential typologies around that, taking advantage of the relationship of a large green space to a large building. And by large building, I'm thinking, 10 to 12 stories, a modest size footprint tower. These could cluster around. They could all have retail and public surfaces at their ground floor, easy access from them to the park space, and they could also have a hierarchy of units within them. So I'd weight the first 5 floors with 2, 3, and 4 bedroom apartments that were scaled to families. Above that, it could be more market rate studios, 1 bedrooms, and grand penthouses on the top, so that families with kids can live right there on the park, can find their way out to the park and the school through a set of stairs that leads directly from their units, and find services at the ground floor, be it a donut shop or a laundromat or a daycare or whatever it may be, available to really create a true community in the traditional sense around that park school open space nucleus. And I think this just makes logical sense. Here we have these great open spaces. We have trees in them that are often taller than a 10-story building here in Portland.
Wow.
So the trees in the buildings create a kind of a shared environment, much like a mini New York Central Park, if you will, if you need imagery for your viewers, or as traditionally would have happened in London, little park squares, or you see this in Boston as well, where you have a beautiful little green park surrounded by high-density housing as a perimeter. It's a model that's existed for many centuries, and I think it's a model that we can replicate in Portland using the park school nucleuses that we already have in place. And then the balance of the neighborhood can see infill of smaller scaled, more blended into the existing single-family home matrix that we have as a legacy of the first part of the 20th century.
This definitely makes sense. I can clearly picture what you're articulating, and it does really make sense to me. And I think there's at least 2 major benefits to the model that you're proposing. One being ease of life and having everything you need, for your basic functions of life, and then also having that park right there. You can live very locally. And by doing so, you're also going to live significantly more sustainably as well.
Well, I think that one of my primary concerns with the type of housing that's being developed in the city of Portland is that it's almost exclusively being built for singles or childless couples, and that because of the way our real estate market works, it's almost exclusively built for those individuals who can most easily afford extremely high rents. And so what we're missing out on is affordable housing for families. The middle class, middle-aged, middle-sized family has been basically eliminated from the market because the current market doesn't build for that demographic, and the existing housing stock, which may or may not be suited for them, has become so desirable and so valuable that family with middle income, which is basically Portland's population, can no longer afford to live within the city of Portland. So when we hear about gentrification and dislocation, it's not just dislocation of certain ethnic or racial communities, but it's really gentrification or dislocation that's affecting an entire economic class of people, regardless of their background, who can no longer afford to live in the city. So in my theory, when we do build anew, rather than thinking about building, including within the building, and this is their inclusionary zoning idea, that they would build a certain percent of units that are targeted at lower income, below market rate units for lower income populations, I would say, well, lower income is becoming the middle class, and that rather than thinking about trying to manipulate the price or rent structure, what we should really be looking at is requiring developers to build more middle class, middle scaled 2, 3, and 4 bedroom apartments or townhomes so that a family can live within them. The affordability thing is still an issue. How do you get them affordable? But that in part would be addressed by the number of units. So in other words, getting the supply of units back in balance with demand should, if we think the market still works, should bring prices back a little bit in alignment. But we have to do that for wage-earning, middle-class, middle-sized families, and that market is not being addressed at all in Portland. And then when you go back to the next step is we need to put them where they would be able to benefit the best, and that's where a park and a school really come into play, because that's what you want for your kids.
So that I have two things that come to mind for me. One is I grew up in a place where we had quite a bit of land. I grew up in a really quite rural area, and that was awesome. I really enjoyed having that land to play on. But I think, though, as a kid, I probably would have enjoyed more of a public place even more. So I still have an open place to play, but there's other kids to play with there. So I don't have to always play with my little brother. So that's just kind of an aside there. But then I wanted to also bring up this issue, which I heard, which sounds so odd to me, which is that Portland, in the suburbs, there's actually more density than in the city center. Is this something that you've heard of as well? And can you verify if that's a true fact?
Well, actually, that's a fact that I've been pointing out to the city now for quite some time, and that I've been writing about. And in fact, that is correct. What I discovered about 6 years ago when I really started to look at how housing and density and urban form are related. In other words, they're not independent things. You know, we talk about density as if it's a number or a ratio, but in fact, it's manifested in buildings. And when I started to study neighborhoods to understand what density meant in terms of building form, I discovered immediately that actually our suburbs are being built out at a far higher density than the inner city. This is directly due to the fact that we have introduced an urban growth boundary, which rings the city and the region and restricts new land availability for development. So we've created an artificial, but I think very beneficial, constraint on our land supply, and that in turn means that developers will want to use land more efficiently, which of course results in higher density land development, higher density housing developments. But at the same time, the city of Portland and the general population within the city of Portland has been very anti-growth. And so through the current status quo of our single-family housing zone, which covers about 70% of the city's land area, and the opposition of most of the neighborhood associations to any change to that zone, has resulted in what I call basically our anti-growth urban growth boundary. And this anti-growth boundary is essentially the invisible line that encircles all of the single-family zones in the city of Portland. So what happens is we've essentially created kind of a crater or a donut, if you will, where the center is very low density, maintaining the status quo that we inherited from, the 20s, if you will. And the perimeter then, in response, is being built up as density as high as can be achieved. And so you'll see that, if you go out to Hillsborough on the west side or Gresham on the east side, you'll see housing developments, whether they be townhomes, fourplexes, or apartment buildings of all sorts, that are, between 30 and 60 units per acre. And then you compare that to the center of the city, where most of the housing development is between 6 to 8 units per acre. So it's a very odd circumstance that I don't believe was anticipated when we established the urban growth boundary around 40 years ago. So then you say, well, what's wrong with that? We're building the density. Well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, first and foremost, again, going back to traditional urban development or just logic, one would expect that the center of a city or the center of a region would have its highest density in relationship to where it has its highest concentrations of commerce, of institutions, of parks, of transportation, of all of the infrastructure and amenities that a city uniquely provides. Those are historically and even today still typically concentrated towards the center of a city, and in Portland being originally kind of traditional in its form, that's where most of these amenities are located. So it would make sense that the city would concentrate its population as close to and within these same areas because that's the most efficient, most beneficial way to do so. Another problem that happens in the way Portland is now developing is that the suburbs are still designed as if it was 1950 with very wide 4 to 6 lane highways, with neighborhoods that are basically designed around dead-end streets, cul-de-sacs, if you will, that are basically, for a large development, you may have really only 1 or 2 entrances or exits from the development. They're sort of treated as if they were independent and isolated pods. And these then are clustered, off of these major arterials. And those, because of our zoning, because of the way we zone land, are single purpose, and yet because they're in the suburbs, they're at an immense scale, and they are separate, therefore, from the huge shopping mall pod or the huge office campus pod or the mega high school, which may be located in another part of the region. So what you find is that we're putting very high density housing, urban density housing, superimposing that on a 1950s suburban auto-based land use system. And it's creating an incredible circumstance of congestion and inefficiency because there's no way that transit can serve these isolated dead-end pods. And there's no way with the distances that are generated that people can reconnect by using a bicycle or by walking. And in fact, the highways, these arterials that they have to ride or walk on, are so huge, so fast, so busy that they are absolutely incredibly dangerous and unappealing places to be on a bike or on foot anyway. So the default is that everyone uses a car. But now instead of the 1950s, 6 to 10 units per acre, we're at 30 to 60 units per acre. So you can see the number of cars increased and needing to use this arterial roadway system is such that when you get out to the suburbs, you have a transportation system that's in gridlock all day long. That doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I think that is the antithesis of what we should be doing as a region.
So it sounds like in addition to increasing the density in the center of the city, that issue might also be addressed by increasing the services that are in Gresham-like areas. I know that Gresham has a big mall and there's some schools and whatnot there, but I imagine that a lot of people who live in Gresham probably do have to commute into Portland for their jobs. Do you have any sort of understanding of that issue?
Well, in Portland right now, what we're seeing is essentially a reverse commute. So in particular with the relationship of Portland to its suburbs on the west side, Hillsborough, in particular where you find mega employers for this region, Intel and Nike located. Both the Intel and Nike employment populations are relatively well paid with relationship to the rest of the labor pool here in the city of Portland. Therefore, they have the ability to choose. They have more options available to them in the housing market because they have more ability to pay for those options. And most of these people, or a very good proportion of them, choose to live in the center of the city in Portland, where we have the parks, the schools, the streetcars, the restaurants, and all the urban amenities that they're looking for. And the trade-off is that they're willing to drive the 10 to 15 miles each way every day to get out to work. And so you see people making, when they can afford to, they make the preference to live in the city because of circumstances that we don't need to go into. Both Nike and Intel are located out in the suburbs. But I don't think the problem gets solved by just saying, well, we need more amenities out in the suburbs. Certainly we do. But the problem with the suburbs, again, is that it's set up on an arterial street system in which streets feed from smaller to larger and culminate, obviously, ultimately in freeways. And development is on a vast scale, but is strictly zoned as single purpose, creating huge distances between each one of the activities that a person might engage in during their day. Therefore, there's no easy way to connect people in their daily activities. And that's contrary to a traditional city, Portland being in certain circumstances an example, where we have a street network. It's a grid, or even if it's serpentine, as it is in many, many parts of the city, it's still a network where there are no dead ends. There's multiple paths from point A to point B, and there's a more even distribution of commercial, educational, recreational, entertainment activities within housing zones and vice versa, so that people have a better chance of connecting their daily activities without resorting to a car to do so. And so the real estate market actually looks at that and says, well, geez, let's call that the walkability score. So if you go and look for a house in Portland now, you'll see one of the key factors, and in fact, one of the things that drives the price of the house up more than anything else, is what we call the walkability score. And that is a tabulation of that particular house's property within its neighborhood and how many opportunities there are to walk to coffee, to restaurants, to school, to laundry, or whatever. That walkability score is extremely valuable. That's where the higher the score, the higher the property value. So people are valuing this ability to engage in their daily activities car-free. The suburbs, because of the way it's formatted, disallow that. And no matter how many other so-called amenities we introduce, unless we can break down the hyper-segregation the zoning is imposed and the lack of connectivity that this dead-end arterial street system is imposed, we're not going to solve that problem out there in the suburbs. That make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. So I have a question for you, which I think would probably create a lot of resistance for a lot of homeowners in Portland. And I'm imagining that in order to implement your plan, that some of the homes, single-family homes, would have to be demolished. Is that the case?
Yes, that's, I would say that's not the case. So let's talk about the demolition problem. With the economic circumstances we have today and the laws we have in place, houses will be demolished. So the question is, which houses and what are they replaced with? That's really the question. Unless we're just going to make demolishing a building, be it a building or house, illegal, we have to ask the bigger question is, can we look at a way to ensure that those houses or buildings that are the most obsolete, the least cared for, possibly the most dangerous because of the toxic materials that were used to build them or maintain them, can we look for a way for the least valued buildings to be the ones that are demolished, okay, versus just a great old house? And then can we look at ways to optimize what happens when those buildings or those houses are demolished? Currently, the city's zoning requires that if you demolish a house, you must replace it with another single-family house. And in many circumstances, because of the way the city is zoned, and I have clients that own properties such as this, if they have an aging duplex or triplex and they were to demolish that, they would have to replace it with a single-family house if it's in a single-family zone. Now, the city is looking at changing that, but in certain circumstances, they're changing it the other way, too. They're actually downzoning certain areas. So the basic premise is that in most circumstances, when a house is torn down, it's replaced by another house. And because the house that's torn down was bought at market rate, let's say the average price of a house right now might be around $350,000. Let's assume then that somebody who's going to replace that house, their start cost, their base cost is $350,000. So before they build anything else, they have to make up that first $350,000. And the way you do that in our current real estate market is to build square footage. You're not going to get more money for 2 kitchens or 6 bathrooms or certain amenities. There's only so much granite you can throw in the house. What people do is they increase the square footage of the house. That's the cheapest way to increase the value of a house. And because people think in terms of dollars per square foot, it's the easiest way to increase the value and make up that $350,000. And so that's why you see these huge McMansions, as they are called, replacing these more modest original single-family houses. So my point is, let's not allow somebody to build a single-family house back. Let's require them to build a 4-family house at a minimum. Now, that 4-family house can be 2 townhomes side by side, sharing a common wall, and then at the ground floor of each one of those townhomes could be an accessory dwelling unit integrated into the townhome, not in the backyard. And these buildings, as I would propose, would be comparable in scale to the McMansion, possibly smaller. They could look very much like the large old homes that everyone in Portland really cherishes, and you would achieve a 4-to-1 replacement ratio, which means that now you're really helping not only your density and housing supply, but by having a 3-bedroom, 2-bath townhome and an ADU, which may be 1 bedroom, and putting 2 of each on each lot at the time that it replaces the old house, we're also increasing the diversity of housing options within the city. And because you can build these far more efficiently, and would have to if you stay within that space volume, than the McMansion, you're also achieving sustainability in terms of, the space we build to the area that we use to enclose it. And that gets back to my ADU argument. The most efficient way for a city to build housing is on this scale is a townhome, and integrating an apartment into it is the most efficient way to build that additional unit. So I think that the city could easily resolve some of these issues by just requiring higher density housing typologies replace single-family homes when something is demolished. And taking that a little bit further, I would really think that the neighborhoods should be engaged in a much more creative and inclusive way in dealing with the where and how of this demolition problem. So in other words, the neighborhoods know or have the ability to do their own self-evaluation, their self-surveying, to establish where the good houses are, where the houses that are dilapidated are, where the open lots are, where the opportunities are for redevelopment and infill, versus where are the things that are truly cherished and give character to the neighborhood. So I would ask the neighborhoods to self-survey, find out who wants to sell their home in the next 5, 10, or 15 years, find out whose house really needs major repair versus who has maintained or restored their house. Find out which properties have the fabulous great old trees or the heritage rhododendron bush, or for some reason, because of the emotional attachment of some particular structure, it should be retained. And then find out, as they're doing that, where the opportunity before new infill could go in, and then suggest or direct development towards those opportunity sites and protect those sites that are really contributing or have value. Now, how would you do that? Again, that poses a legal problem, but we have a way to handle that. It's called the Portland Development Commission, and it's a process that we've done on a larger neighborhood scale in areas like the Pearl District or the South Waterfront, where we decided that we needed to redevelop an area. And then we looked at it as in a holistic manner, and we said, these are structures that actually should be retained and restored, and these are structures or places can actually be redeveloped. And then we enabled, through assistance, through loans, through structuring land deals, et cetera, the ability to direct the development where we want it. We've been very successful in coming up with means to do this sort of redevelopment where we can kind of help the market both achieve new development, but direct it where we want to do it. And I'm just now saying that what I'm trying to say is that we should take those economic principles and those lessons we've learned at a large scale and apply them across the city and neighborhood by neighborhood.
I think I'm definitely following most of what you're saying, but you did just say something to me that surprised me, because previously when we were emailing, you said that zoning was obsolete, and I took that to mean that I thought that you meant that zoning should just be like gone away with, and that you shouldn't have any sort of zoning and you could build whatever you want wherever you want it. But now it sounds like you're saying that it actually needs to be flipped, and you have to require people to build denser. Did I misunderstand previously, or has your thinking evolved? Or
Well, no, I mean, those are two questions. So what I'm saying in principle is that when we demolish a structure, we should be replacing more housing units or more business units or whatever it may be in its place. We shouldn't be on a one-to-one relationship, that we should be increasing the density each time that we have the opportunity to do so, and that the easiest way to really address the demolition situation that we have in our city is to require a replacement of at least 4 units to 1 for each demolition. So that's what I'm saying. So that's really not a zoning issue. It relates to zoning in that I'm saying you would basically be upzoning any given neighborhood or area on a lot-by-lot basis. So each time something comes down, at a minimum 4 go back. Okay? So that is sort of a change to zoning, and I guess you could say, well, that's still zoning. But when I say zoning's obsolete, what I'm not necessarily saying that we abolish zoning altogether, but I'm saying we really have to think about why zoning came into being, what its purpose originally was, what we've done with that concept since, and question whether the way we're zoning our city makes any sense. So what I'd like to say about zoning, and as a starting point, is that zoning in essence is the categorization and subsequent segregation of activities. That's what zoning is. We identify an activity, and then we set a place for that activity to occur. And that happens most fundamentally in the activities that an individual engages in during their day, their daily life. So, think about what you do. You get up, you have breakfast, and possibly you take the kids to school and you go to work. And after work, you might stop at a store, or maybe you stop at a gym. You pick the school kids up, you take them to the park, you take them to soccer practice. Possibly later in the evening, you meet somebody for dinner, or you maybe go to see a movie. What we've done with zoning is we've basically called each one of those an activity and then dedicated a particular zones for it. So in other words, when you get up, you live in your house. By most zoning regulations, your house is in a cluster of other houses in a zone that's dedicated exclusively to houses. You then want to take your kids to school and get coffee. Well, the school, is set off in this particular spot. In the suburbs, those spots are very, very distant, typically, from the housing. You might want to go to work. Well, we have an employment zone or an office zone or an industrial zone, and that's often very distinct and does not incorporate any housing. Therefore, that induces your travel. And then you might want to pick up your kid that's at the school and possibly take them to the park. The park is typically in a very different location as every mother and father in this town know if they're taking them to soccer practice, they may have a very long drive to get to the soccer fields.
Sure.
And then you double back and you want to go to the store. Well, typically you're going to a huge shopping mall. Now, the shopping mall is far removed from the housing, from the school, from the park, and from your office. So what happens when zoning is practiced in the way that we've come to practice it is that we hyper-categorize everything, and then we segregate it out. And that means that we are spending our days commuting between all of our activities to connect our day back up. Now, planners will say, well, then let's have a mixed zone. We can have mixed-use zones. But even in those circumstances, they're still categorizing what can occupy a mixed-use zone. And they get specific enough within zones to say that an employment zone might be industrial weighted, and therefore an office use would be incompatible. So we have circumstances in Portland where we're trying to favor what might be called blue-collar labor, which might be building things, repairing things, making things, but that's considered distinct from maybe the white-collar activity of software, graphic design, architecture, or other kind of professions. Those are sort of thought of as incompatible activities. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. Why are those incompatible? Why can't somebody be designing software in one office and designing a radiator and rebuilding a radiator downstairs? I don't understand the incompatibility of that. But in zoning terms, those are two different activities. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm saying. With zoning, in the way we're practicing it, I think is really a hindrance because it focuses on categorization and segregation of activities and land use. When indeed we know as a society and as an economy, what we really want to do is have diversity and integration. Those are the principles that drive an economy and drive our culture and our society. And so I look, for example, at how high-tech firms such as Apple or Amazon or Google or any of these firms are now designing their offices. So the traditional Mad Men office was hierarchically zoned. You had the private offices at the perimeter of the building with the window. Hierarchically, the person with more power had the corner office. In the interior, you have the secretarial pool. It's very, very highly structured. Everyone sits within their own little glassed-in office or their little cubicle. And what we've learned is that this is really counterproductive and really breaks down the integration of the office community. So what high-tech firms are now doing is they're saying, let's dispense with these zoned little cubes, and let's design our offices much the way a European city is designed, with random streets and little squares that represent breakout spaces and diversity of office environments, all connected with serpentine pathways. There's no particular way, there's no right or wrong way to get across the office building. That induces much more interaction, chance encounters, communication, freedom of movement. If somebody wants to go sit by the window, they can do their work by the window. Somebody needs a quiet place, they go find a quiet corner. Somebody wants to gather with a group of people, they can do it either planned or accidentally. It becomes a much more dynamic space. Productivity goes up, the happiness quotient goes up, the overall, environment is improved. So they're recognizing that, and that's how we're designing office spaces today. That's the thinking. Why wouldn't we think about our city that way? And that's what I'm saying. Our city operates the same way. We have to have as much integration, as much diversity, and as much chance encounter as we possibly can create. And we don't get there through categorization, separation, and segregation. We only get there through integration. So that's why I'm saying zoning essentially is obsolete. We should zone out the most onerous industries or the most incompatible uses like an airport or possibly a rail yard. But other than that, what's really incompatible in a modern economy or a modern society today? I don't see much. So why do we need zoning to be practiced as specifically as we practice it today?
Yeah, I definitely can understand what you're saying there. And I like that you add that last note about some aspects would need to be zoned out, because I was going to ask about, like, what about heavy industry? And obviously, based on what you just said, that would be separate because it could be detrimental to the other functions of the society. So on that note, though, I'm wondering, would it be necessary to require developers, as they're redeveloping an area, to upzone? Or if you just left it open to them, wouldn't market forces drive them to creating more housing in a single space anyways?
Yes, actually, market forces does drive them to create more housing. The developer is a businessman, and he's a pro forma guy. He's looking at how much he can get out of any particular opportunity. So typically, they will look to put as many housing units as they possibly can in a development or on a specific site. Most typically, in our experiences, when I'm designing a building, we're finding that the zoning is limiting the number of units that a developer would like to put in place. And so I think market forces definitely are weighted towards achieving the long-term goal that we want in increasing density. Where the market doesn't necessarily come to the aid of the greater good of the society is that the market doesn't necessarily build for the full diversity of our demographic society. It doesn't build necessarily the most efficient, and it doesn't necessarily build at the highest quality. So rather than worrying about how many units go on a building site or within a development, I really think what the society, maybe through its planning department or through whatever legal envelope that we comply, should, and that might be called zoning, but I think that what we should really be looking to do is to make sure that we have a broad, diverse number of typology of units within each development, that we have affordability range within each development, and that we have materials and design quality that we can say are timeless for the design. So in other words, we don't default necessarily to the latest design fad, but that we look at something in terms of design that we might appreciate in 50 or 100 years. Now, that's a subjective thing, so we can argue about that indefinitely. But that we definitely require the developer use what we would call 100-year materials. At least use materials that have a warranty that's longer than the mortgage or the financing bubble of the building. And right now, we don't have that in place. So we're seeing our buildings being built with extremely cheap materials and very poor craftsmanship in many cases. We're building buildings that aren't going to last past 10 or 15 years or 20 years before they're going to have to start being repaired, restored, or they're just left to sort of fall apart. And I think that is really detrimental in the long term, both to the society and to the economy. So getting back to your question, I think, yes, the market does want to build denser than possibly population at large or the bureaucracies are allowing them to. So we have them on our side there, but they won't necessarily build the diversity of housing that we need, nor will they build to the quality that we need over the long haul.
Okay, that leads me perfectly into the next question I was intending to ask, which in our email correspondence, you mentioned this idea of establishing a set of design principles that would dictate the type of architectural forms that are created across the city. And my initial reaction to that was negative, because I felt like, well, that's just going to limit creativity. But now I'm kind of thinking that maybe what you mean by that is that it's less on the creativity side, but more on the quality side. Do you want to speak to that issue a moment?
When I talk about having design principles, partly I'm talking to the community as a whole and the bureaucracies that set our rules, and partly I'm talking to my peers in the design community. So I'll kind of divide those up, and I'll start first with just material quality. I think that absolutely, in this day and age, whatever your values are, I think everyone agrees that sustainability is one of the most important things that we have to address. And sustainability in building terms isn't just an equation that deals with energy consumption and energy loss, which is where most people put their thinking, but it really has to do with the long-term utility, durability, and maintenance of the building. It's kind of like thinking of a car. You know, when you go to think about buying a car, you don't want a car that loses its value the day you drive it off the lot and is back in the shop within, 6 months or 9 months. You want to think about how long can you go before that first major expense for maintenance. That we should be thinking about our buildings in the same way, but in a greater scale, because our buildings should be lasting at least 100 years before we have to do anything major to them at all, and longer, because once we build these buildings, if we look at the history of human habitation on this planet, they will be there for hundreds and hundreds of years if we build them correctly. So from the most fundamental standpoint, I believe that our buildings have to be built to last a minimum of 100 years and to be able to last indefinitely. So then once you say that, you say, well, what kind of building would that be? So then I refer us back to basic typologies, and I've sort of alluded to those. A townhome, such as you would see in Boston or London or San Francisco, is one of the greatest typologies that you can build for a city, because if built properly, if built with the proper width and the proper number of floors and the proper organization internally, that townhome can be a single-family home, a two-family home, or a multi-family home based on how you divide it up internally with little adaptation, minimal adaptation. That's why cities like San Francisco have been able to grow, expand, contract historically without seeing massive demolition of their housing stock, is because the housing stock, which is predominantly townhomes, is uniquely suited to be modified. The same has happened in Boston, where you see the Back Bay, Beacon Hill, and the South End go through, now a couple centuries of economic, socioeconomic, demographic change, and be able to retain essentially their original character and building stock. And that's because they're easily modifiable internally to meet the needs, the contemporary needs of the society. So there's a typology. Another typology is an apartment building, which we know from experience. We can look at Paris or London or New York. Well-designed apartment buildings with a variety of units can exist forever with moderate to almost no modification. Another typology that is proven to be incredible was the 19th century warehouse or the 19th century factory. We can think of Soho. They were designed as pure space. They weren't designed so specifically to address minute functions, but they were designed as generic space without predetermined specific functions. They become universally modifiable. And so that's the loft movement. We know that within those structures, you can put housing, you can put offices, you can put retail, you can put, event space. You can do anything you want with these buildings. They become extremely adaptable moving forward. So from the standpoint of building, then I think that thinking about typologies that have long-term ability for adaptability would be key, and being built out of materials that allow that opportunity long-term to happen, which means longevity, is key. Then to get to the design issue, what you and I were maybe talking about, what does the building look like? In my mind, when an architect designs a building, that architect should be concerned with the ability of that building to fit into its context and the ability of that building to essentially agree with, therefore, buildings that are around it, but offer the opportunity that the next generation of buildings can relate to it. So in other words, thinking about how your building can be a subset or a part of a greater whole, how you can share your design with what exists from previous architects and what may be to come, so that your building is not just a one-off ego-driven statement for the moment, but is a component of basically a conversation that has been going on in Portland over 100 years, and hopefully will go on for another 1,000. So your building contributes to this overall sensibility, if you will. Okay, so now you're going to say, well, what is that? And that's hard to define, but I think that the mindset is critical. And what I see in the architecture community today is the desire to be as original, as innovative, as different, as unique as possible, as if every architect believes that they are the next Frank Lloyd Wright, and every opportunity is their next Bilbao or Guggenheim opportunity. And I don't really think that there are very many Frank Lloyd Wrights in any generation, and most buildings are not a Guggenheim or a Bilbao moment. Most buildings are not, iconic museums. Most buildings that architects build are what we call fabric buildings that are part of the base fabric of the city. So if you think of it in terms of a symphony, most buildings are like the violinists, or the cellists that are sitting out there. And then sure, there's the pianists who may have, the solo, or the violinists who may have the solo. But most of the orchestra is playing in harmony the basic compositional tone and providing the basis for the unique solo statement. So that's the way I think of a city. We are not all soloists fighting for position on the stage up front. Most of us as architects, as designers, have to take a seat in the orchestra, and then that one who is truly great is given the opportunity for that standout piece. So that's my philosophy. Right now, I don't think the architecture community is there with me. I think everyone thinks that they're the soloist, they're the Frank Lloyd Wright, and every opportunity is their Bilbao or Guggenheim moment.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with everything you just said there, and I like the symphony analogy. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And I had this image as you were speaking of all these different piano soloists trying to play their solo at the same time, and obviously that's going to create chaos. So I think that in that regards, you're definitely right that most of the buildings, they should be about their function. And are they going to last? Are they going to be suitable for their environments 100 years from now? So, Rick, thank you so much for pointing that out to me. I really wish we had more time. I have so many more questions, but we are towards the end. So I would like to pose a question to our listeners now and to ask everybody who's listening, whether you're in Portland or not, what do you think about Rick's plans and Rick's ideas of creating density within the city, rezoning or getting rid of zones in some areas, and creating more of a mixed-use environment, and then also his idea of architects just needing to design more for a fit environment. You can post your comments wherever you happen to be listening on our website, verticalcity.org/podcast, also on YouTube or on SoundCloud as well. Rick, I thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Do you have any just parting words or maybe a call to action you'd like to make to the listeners before we say goodbye?
Hopefully I've given them enough to think about. So I just really want to state that I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners. And hopefully people will think about their environment in a very critical way. And ideally, they'll take that thinking forward to their community and their leadership. Because I think, right now, there's been a lot of dialogue, but it's mostly been in opposition. I think we really need to think about what we can do to bring some comprehensive unity to this discussion and where our values really reside so that we can really advance rather than just fight. So that's kind of my thinking.
Well, great, Rick. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Vertical City. Learn more about the Vertical City concept and continue the conversation by visiting our website, verticalcity.org. I truly hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe to our podcast, leave a review on iTunes, and most importantly, share Vertical City with your friends and colleagues so that together we can create solutions for sustainable living. I'm Lennon Richardson, signing off for the Vertical City team. See you next time.